Good evening, Brennan, and welcome to the Lodge Hope of Karachi, number 337, and our lockdown lecture series. This is meeting number 77, Brennan. It's a great pleasure to have you all back with us on our Tuesday evening. It is really good news that many of our lodges are steadily progressing back towards face-to-face meetings, and I know many in our province will be doing so in the next few weeks, and we wish them all the very best in their endeavours getting back to some sort of normality, and we hope that by 2022 we will all be back to some sense of normality when it comes to our Freemasonry. Brian, as usual, can I remind you of the Grand Lodge of Scotland guidelines when it comes to Zoom meetings? Please keep your video running unless you have broadband challenges, and if you do so, Brian, please drop me a little message in the chat. I won't respond to that, but I just know that you're still there, and please have a recognisable name in the little box as well, Brian. That is very much appreciated. As ever, my usual request, Brian, please can you sign our virtual tile on our Facebook page, just to give Nobby something to do on a Wednesday morning, because he needs something to keep his mind active. But it's very much appreciated for the historians of the future when we talk back about our lockdown lecture series. Thank you so much. Well, Brian, over the course of lockdown, another one of our sister lodges in South Africa, Unity Lodge, or the chap is from Unity Lodge, brother Steve Horwood, has been running the New Masons Academy over Zoom, and he's had a variety of really interesting speakers, and a few of us from Lodge Hope of Karachi have joined the Bren in South Africa to make that daily advancement with the Bren from down there. And it led us to have a bit of an interest in what the Masonic goings on in South Africa, because it's slightly different to what we have happening here in Scotland. They've got multiple constitutions working side by side. So it's a great pleasure to welcome along this evening most worshipful brother Geoff Edwards, a past Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of South Africa. Brother Edwards, the virtual floor is yours, sir, and we look forward to learning all about Freemasonry in South Africa and the words of amity that you're about to talk to us. Thank you, sir.
Brother Gordon, I thank you for that, and all of you, brethren, I thank you for the opportunity of sharing the evening with you. I'm much looking forward to it. It's a subject that I find very interesting, and I sincerely hope you do as well. I am going to try to share screen here. I'm just trying to get the
if you go to slideshow.
Yes, that's I've got a.
Or if you go to the bottom next to 81, there you are.
Great. Can everybody see that?
Yeah, we can. Thank you, Geoff.
Great. I was initiated into Freemasonry in September 1988. In those days, there was a great deal of secrecy around joining the order, and despite my having a Masonic father, I actually knew very little about it. I decided that I wanted to belong, but I really didn't have any idea of what I wanted to belong to. I certainly didn't realize that I would never be invited, but that I had to ask if I could join. And that in its own cost me 10 years of my Masonic life. Looking back, I seem to recollect having the vision of an international brotherhood operating in countries all over the world, but with British royalty, spearheaded by the Duke of Kent at the helm. We must remember, of course, that in those days there was no internet or websites available, and as the Freemasons themselves weren't very forthcoming with information, finding out anything at all was a very significant challenge. Anyway, I got talking to a business friend who was a Freemason and who, like me, had been born in England. But he, in fact, was a member of the Grand Lodge of South Africa. And when I asked him how I should go about joining Freemasonry, he very enthusiastically recruited me into the GLSA. At that time, of course, I had no idea whatsoever of the implications involved in that. Sometime later, I was initiated into Lodge de Goedehoop, which is in fact the #1 lodge on the roll of the GLSA and the oldest active lodge in the Southern Hemisphere. And during the course of the next few months, I discovered that there were 4 different constitutions and many different lodges, each with their own unique ways of doing things. But as the overall experience was very appealing, I just relaxed and enjoyed it. I loved Freemasonry right from the start, even if I didn't understand it very well. It was about 4 years later that I took responsibility for the Masonic Spring Ball magazine. Now, the Masonic Spring Ball is the main fundraising effort to maintain the 5 Masonic homes that the GLSA has in the Western Cape. And the magazine, in fact, was about a 55, 60-page book, of which half of it was in adverts and the other half was in content. And I found myself having to research, edit, and compile articles on a whole range of Masonic subjects, most of which I knew very little about. I came across the Old Master series of articles written by Carl Clody, and that was about 100 years ago. And in one of these, he tried to explain the concept of amity to a young apprentice. I was fascinated by it and set about trying to understand the subject better. The concept is so confused and intricate, but it, in its own way, works extraordinarily well. Hopefully, in this presentation, I will be able to give you some idea of how I understand amity as it operates in the current Masonic world. The picture that we just bypassed from the mid-1990s seems to sum up so much of my earliest impressions. The Duke of Kent visited Cape Town and is seen here with the heads of all 4 local constitutions. And as you will probably gauge from that picture, we worked extremely well together. We are still a very close-knit Masonic community. The first key concept that we have to understand is that every single Grand Lodge is totally independent. It is headed by a Grand Master, and he and his senior management team answer to the members of their own Grand Lodge and to no other body whatsoever. There are literally hundreds of Grand Lodges spread all over the world, and their sizes range from over 200,000 members and over 1,000 lodges to Grand Lodges with less than 100 members in only 3 or 4 lodges. What then constitutes a Grand Lodge? On scanning the internet, I came across this very simple definition. A Masonic Grand Lodge, or Grand Orient, is the governing body that supervises and governs the individual lodges of Freemasons in any particular geographical area or jurisdiction, usually corresponding to a national boundary or other Masonic or other political unit. If only it were that simple, but it certainly isn't. This definition, while approaching the truth as far as where a Grand Lodge's physical boundaries may be located, could also apply to any international or regional organization, such as a sporting body or some other special interest group. In those cases, however, those localized bodies invariably report to some central regional or world structure which sets and governs the rules applicable to all of them. Masonic Grand Lodges are totally independent, and there is no central body to which they must report. Effectively, they make their own rules. Regrettably, this definition tells us nothing about what makes a Grand Lodge Masonic. This is a far more complex topic, and Masonic Grand Lodges address this by referring to defined ancient landmarks. Percy Yance suggests that the Masonic term landmark is derived from the book of Proverbs 22:28. Remove not the ancient landmark, which thy fathers have set. According to Wikipedia, Masonic landmarks are a set of principles that many Freemasons claim to be both ancient and unchangeable precepts of Masonry. Issues of the regularity of a Masonic lodge or Grand Lodge are judged in the context of the landmarks. Because each Grand Lodge is self-governing with no single body exercising authority over the whole of Freemasonry, the interpretations of these principles can and does vary, leading to issues related to recognition. The fact is that different Masonic jurisdictions may well choose to adhere to different landmarks. It is also worth noting that these landmarks really do go back to the very roots of Freemasonry, and that most Masonic writers or historians refer to them in their works, and they cause some very interesting divisions amongst them. All the early Grand Lodges had their landmarks, and once again, there were some intriguing dissimilarities. Having said that, they did seem to get the critical elements correct. The first use of the term landmark appears in Payne's General Regulations, which were published with Anderson's Constitutions in 1718. During the next century or so, there were various attempts to define Masonic landmarks, and the number thereof, and this in itself, pretty much says it all. Dr. Joseph F. Newton saw 4, Roscoe Pound saw 6, Crawley 3, J.T. Lawrence saw 5, Woodford saw 18, Rob Morris 17, Mackey saw 25, the Grand Lodge of West Virginia saw 7, Grand Lodge of New York saw 31, and the Grand Lodge of Kentucky saw 54. All, of course, felt that theirs was complete and correct. Even if such items as fellow crafts have to attend church every Sunday occasionally appeared amongst them. Mackey's list gained a level of acceptance at one stage, but even his list was largely rejected in some quarters. It is interesting to note that he included the Grand Master has the right to make a Freemason on sight, which of course has been linked to the rumors around Nelson Mandela's Masonic standing, and which attracted a great deal of interest in South Africa. Mandela, in fact, we discovered later, was, in terms of that landmark, considered a Freemason by the Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Connecticut. They, in fact, had conferred, had made him a Mason on sight. But where the thing got confusing, of course, is when Mandela passed away and his family were asked about his Masonic connections, and they emphatically denied he'd ever been involved with Freemasonry at all. So even they weren't aware of the fact that he'd been made a Mason on sight. Despite the inconsistencies, the lists also had much in common, and it's interesting to consider that of Roscoe Pound, 1870 to 1964 as an example, he includes 1, a belief in a supreme being, 2, belief in the immortality of the soul, 3, a book of sacred law as an indispensable part of the furniture of the lodge, 4, the legend of the third degree, 5, the secrets of Freemasonry, the nodes of recognition and the symbolic ritual of the lodge, and 6, that a Mason be a man, freeborn, and of lawful age. Grand Lodges, for the most part, seemed to manage to get along with each other and sort of agreed on the key principles, and Freemasonry continued to develop and grow. Amity is defined by the Oxford Dictionary as friendly relations. In Masonic terms, however, it means acceptance for an active relationship. And being out of amity precludes any interaction whatsoever between Grand Lodges. From a practical point of view, Masonic amity really is a very serious matter. And it opens and closes all of the extraordinary benefits of being a Freemason to all of the brethren involved. As people moved around the world, more and more territories looked to establish local Grand Lodges, it became apparent that something more definitive in terms of expectations was needed. And in reaction to this challenge, the UGLE introduced their conditions for recognition of Grand Lodges in September 1929. These are regularity of origin, that is to say, each Grand Lodge shall have been established lawfully by a duly recognized Grand Lodge or by 3 or more regularly constituted lodges. 2, that a belief in the Grand Architect of the universe, God, and his revealed will, the sacred law, shall be an essential qualification for membership. 3, that all initiates shall take their obligation on or in full view of the open volume of the sacred law, by which is meant the revelation from above, which is binding on the conscience of the particular individual who is to be initiated. 4, that the membership of the Grand Lodge and individual lodges be composed exclusively of men, and that each Grand Lodge shall have no Masonic intercourse of any kind with mixed lodges or bodies which admit women to their membership. 5, that the Grand Lodge shall have sovereign jurisdiction over the lodges under its control. That is to say, that it shall be a responsible, independent governing organization with sole and undisputed authority over the craft, symbols, degrees, entered apprentice, fellow craft, and master mason within its jurisdiction, and shall not in any way be subjected to or divided in authority with the Supreme Council or other power claiming any control or supervision over those degrees. 6, that the 3 great lights of Freemasonry, namely the volume of sacred law, the square, and the compasses, shall always be exhibited when the Grand Lodge or its subordinate lodges are at work, the chief of these being the volume of sacred law. 7, that the discussion of religious and politics within the lodge shall be strictly prohibited. 8, that the principles of the ancient landmarks, customs, and usages of the craft shall be strictly observed. Based on my experience, these still tend to be the internationally recognized criteria today, and it is a reality that almost invariably a Grand Lodge approaching us for recognition will proudly declare that they have been recognized by the United Grand Lodge of England, as if that is the ultimate rubber stamp needed. In 1961, with the establishment of the Grand Lodge of South Africa, we drew up our own declaration, and this is now read at all installations and its annual general meetings as our ancient charges. Other than the UGLE document, paragraph 1 on the regularity of origin, all of the UGLE paragraphs are there with the wording often being almost identical. There are a few additional clauses which expand on the UGLE document and relate to the GLSA's particular needs. These are summarized as point 4, all Freemasons must obey the laws of the state and must pay due allegiance to the head of state. Number 6, we acknowledge man's moral responsibility and the fundamental equality of all human beings. Number 7, we refuse to express opinions on or get involved in foreign or domestic state policy. 8, we refuse to relate to pseudo-Masonic bodies who do not adhere to our basic principles. 9, the basic Masonic principles are not secret. We will not go into amity with a body which fails to adhere to them. 11, the former rights of the Grand Lodges of England, Ireland, and Scotland would not be adversely affected by the founding of the Grand Lodge of South Africa. Taking the UGLE's conditions and the GLSA declaration together provides us with a very sound understanding of what Amity comprises of as far as our Grand Lodge is concerned. The reality is, however, that for all the practical reasons, we tend to be guided by the UGLE. They are 200 times our size, have far more resources available to them, and have earned the respect of the Masonic world. We work very closely with them, as we do with the Scottish and the Irish, and we have no reason not to have confidence in them. In considering Amity, though, it's almost as interesting to look at what isn't included. I've chosen to describe these as customs, traditions, and protocols, but for the most part, each of the items listed is entirely at the discretion of each fully independent Grand Lodge. Let's just explore some of them. Titles. These are determined by individual Grand Lodges. There are levels of similarity, and it's common, for instance, to call the Grand Master Most Worshipful. But one African Grand Lodge installs some 12 Most Worshipfuls every year. As another example of variation, the Scots, of course, give an officer title, never an individual. The lodge layout is generally fairly consistent with the wardens in the south and west columns. The Grand Lodge of South Africa layout, however, is to have both of the wardens based in the west. The master always appears to sit in the east, and he is surrounded there by the most senior brethren. That seems to be a common trend. Awards. The concept of jewels is pretty standard, and the Americans in particular also like pins. The past master's jewel seems to be common, but other awards vary between Grand Lodges. We in South Africa, for instance, have what we call the OSM, which is an Order of Service to Masonry, and that is an award of distinction, and it's seen in 1 or 2 Grand Lodges, but it's not common throughout the Masonic world. Rituals, the working of the 3 degrees are a given, but the rituals used certainly are not. The emulation ritual, or a modified version, is fairly common amongst the Grand Lodges that the GLSA interacts with, but our visitors find the very different South African rituals extremely interesting. We, of course, being in South Africa, have the privilege of seeing all 4 constitutions rituals on a fairly regular basis. And I tend to tell people that the South African one tends to be very demonstrative. The home Grand Lodges are far more explanatory, and the 2 work very well together. Symbols. All symbolism revolves around the stonemason's tools, but there are variations. The Grand Lodge of South Africa, for instance, does not really use the cable toe. Interpretation of the symbolism also tends to vary from Grand Lodge to Grand Lodge. Appendant degrees, this can really vary very significantly. We, for instance, in the Grand Lodge of South Africa, have the Lodge of Mourning, which we conduct for a brother that has passed to the Eternal East. But we don't have Knights Templar, Red Cross of Constantine, and several of the others. In some Grand Lodges, the Mark Master is separated from the Royal Arch, and so we go on. In South Africa, we combine the 2. Officers, once again, these tend to be similar, but with differences in some officers and their roles. The Grand Lodge of South Africa, for instance, does not have deacons. The worshipful master and the wardens appear to be common throughout Grand Lodges. Dress, for the most part, dress tends to be smart, but nothing, even aprons, is compulsory. Grand Lodges very much set their own rules as far as dress code is concerned. Senior officers normally seem to wear chains, and the Grand Master's apron is usually adorned with a sun. It is also interesting to note, incidentally, the way that many Masonic protocols have been accepted around the world. We have already learned that nothing is compulsory, but, for example, it is common practice that Grand Lodges are received in order of seniority based on the date that they were consecrated, with the oldest being received last. Freemasonry, in truth, really is a well-disciplined organization, and I can't visualize this sort of thing ever being seriously challenged. Let's move on to the establishment of the Grand Lodge of South Africa. And the role that Amity played in that particular event. Up until 1961, from 1772, when the Grand Lodge of Netherlands consecrated Lodge de Koorhoop in Cape Town, for the next almost 200 years, you had the English, the Scots, the Irish, and the Netherlandic. And all were working very closely in harmony. And the truth is, many of the members would belong to 2 or more constitutions and enjoyed the exchange that went about as a result of that. The aftermath of the World War II, however, saw the Masonic world in turmoil. South Africa had, to a large extent, been shielded from the worst of the disruption, and the 4 constitutions had always been extremely close with many cross-memberships, simply continued with those labors. In Europe, however, this was not the case. Many of the Masonic structures had been broken down, and Grand Lodges were endeavoring to establish themselves in amongst all this activity. The Grand Lodge of France had taken a decision to admit atheists and agnostics. Most Worshipful Brother Davidson, who was Grand Master of the Netherlands, made it known that he would be going into amity with France, and this, of course, would be totally unacceptable to the home Grand Lodges. Right Worshipful Brother Cranston Day, who was the District Grand Master of the local English division, advised Right Worshipful Brother Graham Botha, who was the senior Netherlandic Freemason in South Africa, of what was happening and the implications. Broken amity in South Africa was certainly not acceptable, and Botha duly raised the issue with Davidson, who advised him it might be better if the Netherlandic brethren in Southern Africa simply broke away and formed their own Grand Lodge. Actively supported by the home Grand Lodges, this option was initiated. In fact, the home Grand Lodges assisted us in writing the Constitution and all the other activities that went to the founding of the new Grand Lodge. In 1961, the Grand Lodge of Southern Africa was with a considerable amount of support and assistance from the sister constitutions, was consecrated. Ironically, the potential breaking of amity between the home Grand Lodges in the Netherlands never materialized, but local plans were far too far advanced to effectively change course at that stage. Rhodesia, however, decided to stay with the Netherlands, and the new Grand Lodge was later formally renamed the Grand Lodge of South Africa. Having founded the Grand Lodge of South Africa, the next step was to establish our position in the Masonic world. And this is achieved by entering into amity agreements with other Grand Lodges. Having played such a key role in the Grand Lodge of South Africa's formation, the English, Irish, and Scottish constitutions were in amity right from the outset. And this would inevitably have played a key role as we look to expand. Our Grand Masters have always played a leading role in the sphere of activity, and brethren such as my Swiss brother Sidney Gasson, for instance, who owned his own aircraft, enjoyed a great deal of success as he flew around the world attending other Grand Lodge annual meetings and similar activities. We still look to develop our relationships, and today we are in Amity with 150 Grand Lodges, and our brethren benefit from this as they venture into the world at large. COVID-19 and the move towards online contact is going to further impact on our fraternal relationships, as it is this evening. And it will be most interesting to see just how the Masonic world functions in the years ahead. The fact will remain, however, that Amity will continue to play a prominent role, and that Grand Lodges will continue to base their relationships on the mutual agreement in terms of the conditions under which they operate. Brethren all, I thank you most sincerely for giving me the opportunity to share that with you.
Most worshipful brother Geoff Edwards, thank you so much for that interesting interpretation of Amity and the way in which your Grand Lodge of South Africa was formed and the importance that it meant. I think it's very difficult for many of us here in Scotland, and we've got others from around the world with us this evening actually, but to understand the various challenges of having multiple Grand Lodges. I think our challenge comes with having multiple orders competing for our Bairns' time, let alone multiple constitutions. What we normally do, Geoff, is we ask the Bairn for if they've got any questions for you, and we put them in the chat, and I then run through and ask them. So I'm just bringing up my chat box to have a look. Steve Horwood says, hello, evening from a cooler Cape Town. I know it's winter for you just now, and we do see Steve with his roaring fire on. We've got in Scotland today, Geoff, what we call taps off weather. The sun is actually shining for a change for us. Let's see. It's a comment on the COVID sanitizing points. We've got a brother from Chile with us, Christians here from Chile this evening. Ron, I'll come back to your point later on. We don't actually have any questions as yet, Geoff. That surprises me. I do have a question for you, however. How many lodges are there within your Grand Lodge, and how many brethren do you think are active, not actually Masons, but are attending meetings on a regular basis?
In our Grand Lodge, we have just under 1,000. And we have 55 lodges spread around the country. We work on 5 divisions because the size of the country makes it practical to do so. You know, to get from one side of the country to the other is a 3-hour flight. So it's not something you do easily.
Okay, thank you. There is
the total Freemasons in South Africa, I think, and Steve would possibly have a view on this as well. I think at the moment it's around about the 5,000 mark.
5,000, okay, thank you. We've got a comment from Brother Ian Walsh. Some of the landmarks of your Grand Lodge mentioned are reminiscent of parts of the Grand Lodge of Scotland aims and relationships of the craft as read at our annual installations. Yeah, Ian, I think we can see those similarities there. Sandy Thompson asks, is there a time limit between the degrees under your constitution?
There's not. We have, in fact, funnily enough, as recently as 2 days ago, we've now implemented a completely new system with regard to advancement through the degrees. It's traditionally been around about the 6-month mark. But what we've done now is we've defined what we call advancement criteria for the apprentice and advancement criteria for the fellow craft. And what this means in practical terms is there's a number of exercises that they have to complete before they can move on to the next degree. And this will include things like the number of visits they attend. It will include the extent to which they participate in their own lodge's activities. They'll be required to write a paper on the degree that they've completed. They're required to pass an online questionnaire, which we have. So we've tried to sort of gear it up a little bit, because what we found is that while in some lodges it was very, very effective, in other lodges this really wasn't the case. And the individuals were being sold short in terms of their Masonic experience.
Thank you. I think that's very pertinent. That I do know that in many of the Facebook forums just now, there's a lot of discussion about the changes that people could see post-COVID and how we make that experience for the new initiate even better than it currently is. And I think my own lodge, we're as guilty as the next. There's been a 1, 2, 3 degree culture, and it was every other week you were putting that same brother through and not slowing them down. And there is a lot of discussion, and I think that's really interesting feedback that will probably go to a discussion point on our Facebook later on this evening. Steve Horwood asks, well, he states, "Thank you, Geoff, for a wonderful talk. Can you explain why it was not just easier to absorb the Netherlandic members into the other 3 constitutions at the time?"
It's an interesting thought. I wasn't there at the time, so I can't give you a heads-on answer to that one. But I think even today that the 4 constitutions and the brethren, you'll find many brethren in constitutions. I think Steve would bear me out on this. There's many South African brethren that are member of the Grand Lodge of Scotland, and that having become members of the Grand Lodge of Scotland, they will fiercely fight to retain that, and so it goes on. I think it's like all of clubs and societies. When people band together, they like to keep it that way if they can.
Yeah. David Park's got a question. He starts off, "Thanks, Geoff, very interesting. You stated you lost 10 years of your life by not asking to join Freemasonry. Here in Scotland, it is the opposite. It is looked down to ask to join." I think that's just a point on the differences. I think many of us come to Freemasonry for different reasons, Geoff. I think many of us come, myself, I came to my father and my grandfather's lodge. So I was harping at the bit, 18-year-old to join, but then I know other family members have never joined their grandfather's lodge because they felt they needed to be asked as well, and then people pass away. So I think there's lots of different ways in which we do come to the craft.
I think it's changed as well, Gordon, if you don't mind me saying so. There's been a significant, in those days it was fairly secretive. One of the reasons my father didn't talk to me about it is because you weren't supposed to talk about it to other people.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds ridiculous nowadays. Nowadays we're very much more open. We do tend to promote it more. So I think it is a slightly different world.
I think us as Scots Freemasons, we would possibly suggest that was a more of a UGLE standpoint, particularly after the Second World War, and many of the Continental Masons went that way. But in Scotland, we're all Jock Tamson's bairns, and we had the square and compasses on the buildings externally. We advertised in the local paper, and there was a slightly different concept of that Freemasonry, which in many people's eyes continue to this day about that level of secrecy. But one thing I do believe in, we do need to attract good men to join us.
Yes.
That's our future.
Absolutely.
Brother Monroe from Paris asks, with a wide mix of nationalities in South Africa, how many different languages are used in the rituals?
At this point, 2. And it's mainly English, and we do also use Afrikaans. Interesting enough, there's there's never been we are starting to find more and more of the local African community becoming Freemasons, but they have been very slow. You know, I think a lot of it goes back to the days of apartheid, where they weren't allowed to join. In fact, I could tell a story about that as well. Freemasonry was the first ever society in South Africa that was allowed to bring a completely non-white lodge into the membership with no conditions attached. That was 15 years before apartheid broke down. But that's a separate story. I'll produce a different paper on that one. But what we have found, we've had enormous numbers of West African people joining, brethren joining. They come down to South Africa, they live in South Africa, and West African Freemasonry is very, very strong, and they all want to join. So we have a very multicultural mix, but the third dominant language in it is French. And we are talking about the possibility of even opening a couple of French lodges, but we haven't at the moment.
I think that is a very interesting point, because I think there is that legacy, and I don't really want to go into that legacy this evening about apartheid and the various challenges that your country faced over many years. But I think Masonry is one of those levelers, and I think we're beginning to see that with Prince Hall lodges all now being fully accepted in the US as well, that under one God we're all the same ultimately. And I think that comes back to one of the principles you put in your landmarks about that. Ian Kennedy, talking about Mandela, and I think you did touch on this in the presentation, but we'll ask you again, how much of a Mason was Mandela? Was this merely an honorary award, or did he actually attend the meetings?
No, it was an honorary award. From what we can make out, it was bestowed on him by Connecticut, the Grand Lodge, the Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Connecticut. And that one landmark I referred to, where the Grand Master had the right to make a man a Mason on site, is pretty much what happened. The Grand Master of Connecticut made Mandela a Mason on site. Okay. And I think there's even a picture of him in the cloak. You know, the problem with these pictures nowadays, you never know whether they've been photoshopped or not. But it seems that one was authentic, but once he'd taken the cloak off, that was the end of it.
Yeah, okay. Dudley asks, what working do you practice under, he asked about under the English constitution, but I think under your constitution, are there many different workings as there are in England? So in terms of your ritual, is it standardized, or it does, like the Scots, it's different pretty much wherever you go, or depending on who's presenting it?
No, we have standard rituals, and all our lodges adhere to those.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Worshipful Brother Geoff. Very interesting talk. Another question, are you as a Grand Lodge giving attention to recruitment and retention? And is there anything that you can say to what you're doing there?
It's an essential. And we try to give as much of it as possible. What we're finding, one of the reasons that we've said about looking at the advancement criteria, is that what we're finding is that the young men that tend to be approaching us nowadays are approaching us because they want to elevate themselves in terms of their ethical standards. They want to conduct themselves in the type of manner that Freemasonry promotes, and they want to be part of a society that believes in that. And we're seeing this is becoming more and more the issue, which is interesting, because I don't think it was 20 years ago, but it certainly is today. You know, the young men of today, certainly in this part of the world, are looking for an experience along the lines that Freemasonry offers.
Okay.
And it's essential we give it to them, or they're just going to leave again.
Yeah, I think we're seeing some lodges here in Scotland trying to make subtle changes to what they're doing to attract the younger ones. And we've heard of the university schemes as well that are out there to try and attract and retain. My immediate past master makes a comment about joining a lodge, and he states, as serving away from home, I always thought my father would be asking me. My younger brothers had joined, so I asked them why he had not asked me, and they said, you have to ask him. Siva comments, it is a strong possibility, inferring from Mandela's ability at one point of time to communicate effectively to the then English president and others in pre-independent South Africa, that Mandela was conferred a Masonite site. When was it that Grand Lodge of Connecticut made Mandela a Mason and a brother? Was it early on in his presidency, or was it later in his life?
Gordon, I don't know the answer to that. As I understand it, it was fairly early on. It was in one of his early tours of the United States that it happened, but I can't give you a definitive answer.
Okay, thank you. Just checking that there's a comment, and probably not for discussion this evening, because it's quite a challenging comment, but you may wish to give a few words on it, Geoff, and it comes from one of our past masters. How do we resolve our compliance with the law and the bills of human rights and freedom of association with our not accepting relationship with the bodies making a similar journey, i.e. women's Freemasonry and co-Freemasonry? I don't think that's really associated with this presentation this evening, but if you do have a thought on that, you feel free to pass that over to us.
We have a basically a good working relationship with the Lady Freemasons, but in terms of I think pretty much the same as yourselves. It's we're not entitled to bring ladies into the Grand Lodge of South Africa. We don't plan to do so at this stage, and we're certainly not under any pressure to do so. But we have a very sound relationship with the local Lady Freemasons. Yes, no problem.
That's great, thank you. Alan, I do know that you've talked about this in the past, and I think it was a subject that won't go away, and I think we will be debating that going forward. Most worshipful brother Geoff Edwards, thank you so much for coming along here this evening to the Lodge Hope of Karachi number 337 and being our 77th speaker at our lockdown lecture series. As I said earlier, I'm not sure if you were on at the beginning when I said many of us have enjoyed our meetings with brethren from all the constitutions at Steve Horwood's weekly Zoom meeting on a Thursday night, and we hope to continue doing that. Because the one thing that Zoom has brought the world of Freemasonry is certainly it's brought us a lot closer, and we're now learning so much about different constitutions and different ways of working and different practices. And it's very interesting to hear what's happening on the other side of the world, quite literally from where we are just now. So on behalf of everyone here, our members and our guests, I thank you. I've got one final question. What football team do you support? Because I think the books behind you are all football related books, if my eyes are not deceiving me.
I'm a Spurs fan for over 60 years. I can make a long way with the team. Okay. Anybody that's ever watched them will know that there's been good times and bad times.
Well, that's very true. That's very true. And are you going to lose Harry Kane to Man United before the transfer window closes then?
That's silly of me. Don't know.
Geoff, thank you once again. Brethren, next week we have Brother Matthew Christmas joining us, and Matthew's going to talk to us about the patriarchs in Freemasonry. It's slightly away from the normal type of presentation that we've given at the Lodge Hope of Karachi lecture series, when we've tried to keep it of a more generic and or historical point of view. We've had one or two that have delved into the secrets and mysteries of our craft. This is slightly touches there, Brian, but it really delves back into the stories of the patriarchs from the Bible. So I'm sure Matthew Christmas is, for those who know him, is a very well-renowned speaker. He's a great character, and I know we'll have a very good presentation from him next week. Geoff, at this point in the proceedings, we allow the Brethren, we trust them to unmute themselves and to say their thank yous and their good nights to you. So once again, Most Worshipful Brother Geoff Edwards, past Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of South Africa, thank you so much. Brethren, the floor is yours.
Brother Geoff, thank you for a really wonderful paper. It was most enjoyable and very instructive. Thank you.
It was absolutely superb. Thank you very much indeed. That was really good.
Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation this evening. Thoroughly enjoyed it. Once again, thank you.
Well done, Geoff. Excellent. Well done.
Very much, Geoff.
Thanks, Geoff. Really enjoyed your presentation. Thank you.
Brother Geoff, thank you for your talk tonight. Very nice. Very good.
Thank you, brethren. These evenings are remarkable, and they really show that COVID, as you mentioned earlier, Gordon, COVID has introduced things we never dreamed of.
Thanks very much, Brother Geoff.
Very much, Geoff. Very good.
Thank you very much, Brother Geoff. That was absolutely superb. I really enjoyed that. I learned something.
Thank you,
Thanks
Brother
very much,
Geoff.
Brother
Excellent.
Geoff.
Well, thank
Give
you.
you 5, Brian.
First class.
Hey, Brother Edwards, very enjoyable.
And for Brian. We do a countdown at the end, Geoff. It's become one of our traditions. That's just so they know that Coronation Street will be starting in 5 minutes or something, or East End or so, to get away in time. But some of our audience have their own traditions. And some of them are very upset because Love Island ended last night as well. And 3, Brian.
Thank you, Geoff. It was very educational. Thoroughly enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Geoff.
Well done, Brother Geoff.
Later.
Thank you, Geoff.
Brian.
Thank you, Geoff. Hope to see you in Lodge soon again, and good night, brethren.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you, and good night.
Hey, stay
Thank you,
safe,
Gordon.
all. Stay safe.
Once again, Most
Pleasure.
Worshipful Brother Geoff Edwards, thank you so much on behalf of the Lodge Hope of Karachi. Good evening, Brian.